Hello, and it is time for another key question video, chapter 30 this time. Number 1, how did the U.S. handle political radicals in the 1920s, and give specific examples? Well, with the first Red Scare and after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Americans were very afraid that communism was going to take over America. Combine that with the fear of immigration, and we have some action taken against them. First, you have Mitchell Palmer and his raids on immigrants who he believed were radical anarchists or communists. He would raid their houses, and he would try to deport them from the country. Other than that, we also have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, who tries its best to get laws passed that would get rid of political radicals in America. Probably the saddest moment in how we try to get rid of political radicals or how we handle them is the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, which was the arrest and eventual execution of two Italian anarchists. Unfortunately, there wasn't much evidence that they were guilty of the crime, but they ended up being put to death anyway because of their nationality and because of their political beliefs. Number 2, how did the U.S. attempt to stop immigration? As mentioned before, the Ku Klux Klan rises during this time period to have millions of people join the group, and their main push was to stop immigration. So what they create are what we call quota laws. The first one was the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which capped immigration at 3% of the amount of people living in the nation at that time. The second act is the Immigration Quota Act of 1924. What this act did is it cut down the number to 2%, and it even based it upon the 1890 census. What that meant is that new immigrants would be specifically targeted. And as shown in the charts in class, you can see that it dropped them from about 650,000 people coming to America each year down to 20,000 for all people from South and Eastern Europe. So it was effective in stopping them. Number 3, describe the unintended consequences of prohibition on the United States. Prohibition created and begun by the 18th Amendment and enforced by the Volstead Acts kicked off the end of the sale, transportation, and production of alcohol. The unintended consequences of prohibition, however, was that Americans pretty much just ignored the law. The phrase often uses, or the word often uses, flouted. They openly ignored it. That led to the rise in speakeasies. This also led to the rise in bootlegging, which would lead to the rise of organized crime. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago led America down a dark path of violence and just outright disobeying the law as men with money manipulating and controlled cities and police forces and politics. And so it really had the opposite effect. It created more crime and issues than it was supposed to solve. Not only organized crime, but also domestic abuse increased during this time period. Violent crimes beyond murder did, assault, burglary. So it did not have the consequences that they hoped that it would. Furthermore, it cost America a lot of money to enforce it. Not only did we lose out on tax revenue by taxing things like whiskey and taxing things like beer, but we also were spending far more money to try to enforce these laws that no one wanted to follow. Number 4, how did Americans challenge tradition in the following areas? Religion, women's values, and literature. For religion, we have the Scopes Monkey trial. People began questioning Christian fundamentalism, the idea that the Bible held all truth and that it was God's word directly from Him, and you can't argue with it. So in the Scopes trial, we have Tennessee pass a law which makes teaching evolution in the classroom illegal. John Scopes, substitute teacher, teaches evolution, and that leads to a trial in Dayton, Tennessee, in which Clarence Darrow embarrasses William Jennings Bryan, and eventually leads to that law being undone. But it just showed that there was a battle between traditional views of Christianity and creation in the classroom. As far as women's values, there's a lot of ways that we could talk about women's values changing. With their involvement in the workforce and with their newly found ability to vote, women express themselves quite freely. And so this is brought about by the flapper movement, where women dressed how they wanted, acted how they wanted, swore as much as they wanted. Women fought against their traditional role in society and sought to be much more independent, and we called those women flappers. Furthermore, we have Margaret Sanger, and Margaret Sanger is a woman who began the American Birth Control League, which would eventually become Planned Parenthood. And she wanted women to be able to take control of their sexual health and their sex lives. She wanted them to be able to have whatever kind of sexual activity they wanted without controls or judgment. And so she believed birth control would help accomplish that. As far as literature, we have the lost generation of men like E.E. Cummings, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. These men wrote books that challenged the joy of the era. While America's living freely, they were disillusioned with how life actually was in America. With all its material gains, we felt empty. And so you take The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald, which describes a man who, despite having all of these gains, he feels empty inside because he doesn't have the one thing that he truly wants. So that is how literature challenged it with The Lost Generation. Number 5, what enabled the mass consumption economy of the 1920s, and what impact did it have on society? What enabled it was the creation of the assembly line. Henry Ford was able to take his Model T automobile and not only make it to have one coming off the line every few minutes, but he also was able to sell it at a very low price because of mass production. This makes a lot of different products accessible to Americans. It makes a lot of things be able to be mass produced, like refrigerators and radios. And so because of that, America was able to consume things at a larger rate than they were before. Unfortunately, that has a negative impact, as we'll see at the end of the 1920s, when we have an economic crash in the practices that followed. But when you think about the impact it had on different industries and how many jobs and wealth, how much wealth was created by it, the assembly line really does create the economic boom of the 1920s almost single-handedly. Other effects that it had would be mass advertising. This is the first era where we really begin trying to convince Americans to buy goods they don't necessarily need, but we make it seem like it's a necessity by advertising to the masses. Furthermore, we create a lot of debt. People think they need these products, and so they gladly spend money they don't actually have in order to have them to keep up with those around them. This debt will have a massive effect on the economy toward the end of the 1920s. Then finally, we have scientific management. If you've ever been in a business where it's all about the efficiency of movement and efficiency of the use of time, scientific management is where that comes from. If you're going to run an assembly line and you're going to make as much money as possible and keep things as efficient, you need to run everything scientifically. Consider that this goes beyond just the factory. We begin applying this to all kinds of society, including, well, education. So the mass consumption economy brought about by the assembly line and scientific management has a massive effect on several different areas of our lives. Number 6, what impact did the radio have on U.S. society? The radio can't be understated in its effect. First of all, it binds the nation together. We're able to connect what would have been long areas of travel to get a message across. We're able to tune in to news. We're able to tune in to sports. This allows us not only to be more connected in what's going on in our country, but it also creates the first wave of celebrities. People like Babe Ruth and many other sports figures are able to gain fame through this time period because we can finally listen to them live with everyone else around the world. Combine that with the disposable income of the era, and we have a lot of people more involved in just having fun than ever before. Number 7, what was the Harlem Renaissance? Harlem Renaissance is African Americans who moved to the North, specifically the city of New York, to escape in the Great Migration. They have a massive cultural movement, which is meant to bring pride to African Americans, that even though they're looked down upon, they should not feel bad about themselves, rather be proud. So you have lots of writers, among them Langston Hughes, who writes many poems about their pride and how they should look up at themselves and not down at themselves. Then you have musicians like Louis Armstrong. You have men like Duke Ellington, who also write songs. The funny thing is, in New York, they had a club called the Cotton Club, where white people came to watch black people perform. So what's interesting is, even though whites looked down their noses at blacks, they were very, cognizant or aware of the talent and creativity of African Americans. Then you also have some black nationalist movements begin, specifically Marcus Garvey. He pushed for African Americans to, rather than accepting, or rather working their way into white society to be accepted by them, he rejected fighting for whites' approval and instead suggested that blacks kind of break out on their own. He created the Black Star Line, which connected African Americans, to Ghana and other African nations. So by separating blacks from the rest of America, they were able to break out on their own and really have pride without white acceptance. Number 8, what unwise business practices helped create the economic boom of the 1920s? Well, when you have laissez-faire government relaxes regulations and stops watching over the marketplace and over businesses. Because people trusted there would always be a boom, they began investing in the stock market quite heavily. Even regular people would take out loans because the stock market was constantly rising. They would take out a loan to buy stock, expecting it to rise over a few years, and then they would sell that stock for profit. The problem is that a lot of companies began lying about their profits, and rather than being honest about how their company was doing, they created a bubble between the actual value and the perceived value on the stock market. So really, the economic boom was built on a lot of lies by big businesses, claiming that they were making profits when they weren't. So what else went into this struggle? Well, first of all, you have the assembly line. Although it was beneficial economically, it also led to some issues where you have warehouses full of refrigerators and radios that weren't being purchased because they could make way more than people could buy. But since this is the first era where we could do that, they didn't understand that law of economics. Furthermore, American consumers spent way more than they actually had. They went into debt and overconsumed these products, which meant that everything they had was on credit. In fact, statistics point out that about 80% of Americans had no savings in the bank, and yet the majority of products were bought on credit. So what's that mean? Eventually, those businesses will come crashing down, the banks will collapse, and people will have no money to pay off the debts that they owe, and so this boom will eventually become a bust. Anyway, that is the 1920s. Rather a quick summary of a pretty dense subject and time period. But alas, that's just how it goes sometimes. If you have any questions or want to discuss anything in more depth, please let me know. Otherwise, that's it.